Hello there, folks. Pedantic Skeptic here. Today, I feel like just doing a little bit of a rant. So there is a lot on my mind, and I have responded to a number of people, especially conservatives and people who are trying to push particular agendas, where they come up with these propaganda points. Sorry, I do a lot of plant stuff, but anyway, um, propaganda points about, godlessness causing societal collapse. And so I wanted to cover a couple of things, that I'm sure that anybody in the skeptic community has heard more than once. So let's just get right into this. So one, they took God out of schools, and that has caused all sorts of problems. Um, Now, I should put a disclaimer here. In America, it's oftentimes conservative Christians who push some of these points in this rhetoric, and I'm not saying that every Christian out there has these particular views. The majority of Christians, I would say, are not these uber conservative evangelicals who believe things like, oh, because there are fewer Christians in America, we're having problems X, Y, and Z. Most Christians don't have that particular viewpoint. It's just the really loud, vocal ones and the ones in our government and, local and, national governments have some of these views. So, the first is they took God out of schools, and that is why there are fewer religious people. So the first thing I wanted to say there is they didn't take God out of public schools. What they did was they said public school teachers can't make their students believe in their version of God. That's all they did. Students are free to have and express within reason their religious beliefs. Now, it would be one thing if, you're taking a class and some kid, walks through the you know, classroom carrying a cross, reenacting the crucifixion and stuff like that while you're trying to learn science. But, being a public school student and, saying, that you're a Christian, nobody really gives a shit. Nobody's going to have a problem with that. The problem becomes when the teacher says to all the students, because I'm, part of this denomination, you all will also have to convert or be part of this denomination, or you're going to fail my class, or something like that. That's when it becomes a problem. It becomes a problem when the teacher's like, okay, before we start class, we're all going to pray. That's the problem. That's what they did. They just said you're not allowed to do that anymore. Okay? They didn't really take God out of schools. They just took teachers' abilities to use the power dynamic they hold over their students, um, to push their particular religion on those students away, because it's not fair to do that. When I grew up, we had teachers who were religious, and they were perfectly okay saying, like, oh, I'm Jewish, I'm Catholic, whatever. And we didn't really care as long as they weren't getting up and preaching to us. They weren't going to get in trouble for it, and they never, and, I would not advocate for any of my teachers who I had as a student, to be in trouble simply for stating what religion they belong to if they wish to do that. I don't care. Nobody is taking God out of the classroom, whatever that means. The next talking point that I have heard is, you know, because of godlessness, we are seeing an increase in whatever, you name it, all sorts of crimes, or all sorts of bad things. Like, we're seeing an increase in poverty, we're seeing an increase in homelessness, we're seeing an increase in suicide rates, we're seeing an increase in murder, rape, all this other stuff. There are a couple of things that these people pushing these particular agendas, um, are not remembering. First of all, the thing that is very important to acknowledge is that it's not necessarily that these things are happening more often. So first, about there's increased godlessness and this and that. There are statistics that show that a greater proportion of Americans today identify as some sort of religiously unaffiliated than they did 50 years back. Now, whether or not people are coming to their senses and realizing that religion as we define it and as we define God is total bullshit, I'm sure there's also the factor of people are less ashamed to admit that they don't believe in God anymore. It is not just there are more people today that don't believe in God. There's also that portion of people whose parents would never admit that they're atheist, even if they actually are atheist. But the kids are like, yeah, I don't care, I don't believe in God. Um, you know, there's that going on. And I've seen this, from personal experience with, people who I grew up with. And, I grew up in Connecticut, and Connecticut is not a religious state at all. There are religious people who live in Connecticut. Um, most of them are pretty level headed, I will say, but, Connecticut is not nearly as religious as Colorado, and it's not nearly as religious as, say, Texas. Um, and even there, there are people who are like, I could never admit that I don't believe in, whatever. I ran into a lot of people, especially from previous generations, who would tell me in private, like, I don't believe in this. But in public, they would never, ever let on to that. So that's happening. The other thing is that, yeah, there are fewer religious people in general today. Great. Now, whether or not, because a lot of these surveys still aren't always delineating between religiously unaffiliated and atheist, and those are two different distinctions. You can be non-religious but still believe in some sort of God, depending on what your definition of God is. Okay, there are some people who are like, if you aren't practicing a specific religion, that makes you atheist, and those people are the hardest to communicate with because they tend to think that your behavior is always an indicator of what is going on in your head when it's not. There are people who don't practice religion who still believe in some sort of God, okay? But aside from that, there are also more people who just don't believe in God. But we don't have the clearest resolution as to where that delineation falls right now. And that's not the worst thing. I am more concerned about how people are acting than what they actually believe in their head, But my concern would be, how is your religious affiliation an indicator of your particular behaviors? Now, there will be people who point to those studies that are like, well, when children are religiously affiliated, they're less likely to do, certain deviant acts, such as petty theft and vandalism. Now, whether or not your religiosity is a strong predictor of, like, are you going to commit a violent crime in your 30s? That's not clear. But what is clear is that in general, religious teenagers are less likely to get into trouble, like, spray painting shit or, like, public urination and just petty random shit like that. Of course. But it's not because of the religion. It's not because they believe in God. It's because they're part of a community that is supporting them and giving them something better to do than to go draw penises on buildings, okay? And I'm not saying that the only people who are drawing penises on buildings are atheists, but I would have no issue accepting that more people who are atheists are responsible for, you know, you go into the bathroom stall and there's some stupid, vulgar thing written on that bathroom stall door that's like, call me for a good time, and you call the number, and, like, it's some automatic thing that's like, you have reached the tooth fairy, or, there's all sorts of that immature bullshit out there. I mean, please don't dial random numbers you find in the bathroom stall, okay? Please. Please, just for me, please don't do it. Please. Anyway, um, yes, but it's because of the community aspect. Because you see the exact same thing when people are parts of clubs, after school programs, intramural sports. It's not confined to religious affiliation. It's just that if you have 100 people who are religious, 100 religious students and 100 non religious students, you're going to have a greater proportion of those religious students who are in a community because religion is a community. You're going to have 100 people who are all religious, who are all in a community. Then you have 100 people who are non-religious. Maybe 70 of them are in some other community, like an intramural or an after-school club program, what have you. then you have, the 30 who are not. And that could be for a number of reasons. Um, for me, there were a lot of things that I didn't do just because and especially when I was younger, I had a lot of mental health problems as far as how I got along with people. I wasn't violent. I don't want to say I was shy. I was avoidant. I didn't want to be near people most of the time when I was younger, when I was in high school. I've gotten a lot better as I've, gotten older and gotten help and just, matured. I've gotten a lot more social and outgoing with people. I still have my limits, I stopped going to, I really love insects. I really love entomology. I stopped going to my entomology club at school because it just got way too crowded and way too overstimulating. You couldn't go into it's a small room, and when it's packed with people, it is really loud. It is really just too much for me to deal with. Last year, when there were like 10 people in the entomology club, great, I would go whenever I had a chance. I can't do that this year. And it's a double-edged sword. I'm really glad that there are a lot of people interested in entomology, but I'm really disappointed because I'm not the only neurodivergent person who's had to call it quits on the entomology club at CSU because of how crowded and overstimulating that environment gets. Okay? And, maybe we'll do something about that. But that's a different matter. I'm going to hold that thought. So, you know, I have no problem acknowledging data. But I do have a problem with taking that data and running with it to say things that it doesn't mean. Okay? It doesn't, when kids are part of religion, they're not behaving better because they're believing in a God. One, there are religions that are not theistic. Okay, like some forms of Buddhism, for example, are non-theistic. Um, and you have the same effect because they're part of a community. It doesn't have to do with anything God related. And secondly, even if belief in God made you behave better, it doesn't mean that God is actually real. It just means that the belief in God makes you behave better, which we find is not true. That brings me to my next, well, actually, that'll be the point after the next point. So, basically, we have more people who are non-religious in the first place, more people willing to admit to being non-religious. And the reason we know that is because surveys that are more anonymous, and I don't just mean, you don't put your name, I mean surveys where it's online, so it's harder for researchers to track where that, response was shipped to them from. For example, we have better ways of making things anonymous these days. People are more willing to be honest about stuff like that when they're anonymous. And it's reasonable. Okay? So, we have people who are more willing to admit that they're not part of a religious group. Now, other things that are true, as far as what gets talked about more. There Most prominently, there's a YouTuber called Shock of God who's like, oh, atheists are the most likely group of people to commit suicide. Okay, one, this guy doesn't actually give a shit if somebody who's an atheist commits suicide. He doesn't like atheists, he really can't stand them. But the other important thing, number two, well, other than the fact that that is not actually true, um, there's not really good data on your religious affiliation being the being a predictor of whether or not you're going to commit suicide. Now, it is very likely that having a belief in God could be a constraint against committing suicide, depending on what version of God you specifically believe. And that's where things get wishy-washy, because there are some denominations of Christianity that don't believe suicide is sinful, for example. And not every religion views suicide as sinful. Um, so not every God would view suicide as sinful. But aside from that, when you just say demographic, any way of identifying a person as a demographic, cis white males who are, I believe, between the ages of 19 and 26 are the highest demographic of people who commit suicide. It has nothing to do with whether you're a theist or an atheist. Also, the other thing you have to remember, especially because of the religious sensitivities, especially back then, suicide has historically been a topic that people didn't talk about. And of course, we want to be sensitive about the topic, but it does need to be talked about. We need to talk about this issue. We need to do it carefully and tactfully, but we can't sweep it under the mat like previous generations have. What I'm getting at here is back in, the 30s, 40s, 50s, up until very recently, if somebody in a family committed suicide, it was generally kept hush hush. It was generally not acknowledged. You still see this in colleges, and there's a reason that I'll get to next. But when students die of suicide in college, they don't advertise that like in their reports of like this year at our campus, this number of whatever happened, Um, this number of fires happened on campus. This number of graduate students had their own homemade laminar flow hood catch fire and they had to spend a week rebuilding it this year. Yeah, that happened to me. It's a long story. Somebody accidentally set my flow hood on fire. It's fine. Nobody got hurt. We got everything taken care of. The flow hood is back up in operation. We're good. But somebody did accidentally set my laminar flow hood on fire. That was a fun day. Not really. I'm being sarcastic. But yeah, my flow hood got fire. There are reports of how many assaults happened on a given campus every year. How many, non-violent crimes happened. Reports on how many people drop out. There really aren't reports on student death, especially death by suicide. But it does happen. We know it happens. We know that on any given year at any given college campus, you're going to have at least a few people who kill themselves. Unfortunately. Now, in colleges, one of the reasons why they don't report that is because, they want to keep everybody safe. Sometimes, especially in that age group, for whatever reason, when one person does go to that level of, how do I put it? When somebody who has a lot going on, under a lot of stress, new stress that they've never had to cope with before, and the reason this happens a lot in undergrad circles, especially, is because of the developmental stage of these people. But, these were people who had generally, for the most part, overwhelmingly, lived at home with their parents. They went to high school. They had, a set number of hours they had to spend on their work. They had a huge community of friends that they had known since they were very young. Um, Especially if you grow up in areas where, the population isn't big or the population is pretty crowded. So in the Northeast, for example, especially Connecticut and Rhode Island, like my hometown, there were like two public high schools you could go to. So there were like three public middle schools and two public high schools. So chances were very, very high that your bestie from middle school was going to go to the same high school as you. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a very good chance. So just imagine you're a person who's still developing in your brain. I'm 26, so the certain parts of my brain are just finishing up their development now, and that's kind of cool to think about. Like I've been alive for over a quarter century, and there's still cognitive functions that haven't finished coming through yet. It's really mind blowing. Um, and so, um, when you're in that developmental, like that vulnerable stage where you have this comfort zone, you have your family whenever, and I'm not saying that everybody's family is functional and good. I had really abusive family, and I'm glad that I got the fuck away from them. But on average, hopefully, most people have a stable enough circle of family and friends where, like, these are people they're comfortable being around. Um, for me, it was mostly like my dog and, things like that. But, most people, they are suddenly torn away from that circle. And, there were some people who I went to high school with who went to the same college as me because we were just over state lines. Well, no, we were an hour away, but, um, now that I've been in Colorado for almost 2 years, an hour is not a lot of driving, but, when you grow up in Connecticut, it really is, Anyway, you're torn from that comfort, and then you're thrust into this environment where suddenly you have to know how to function completely on your own. You have to be an adult for the first time in your life. Okay? Hopefully. You know, I had to be an adult for the first time in my life at a way younger age, and I'm not going to get into that right now. Um, that's a whole other story. Um, so if you're curious as to why I had a lot of mental health problems, it's because of that. But I'm not going to delve into that right now. That is for another day. Um, but when you're suddenly forced to be an adult for the first time and you're no longer answering to teachers, because professors don't really hold you responsible for your work, they just fail you if you don't go to class. You're suddenly in a new environment, you're suddenly having to meet new people, and you're still a social being. You're suddenly away from everything you've known. Sometimes that triggers underlying mental health conditions to crop up that you didn't know you had, and that can cause an increase in suicidal ideation and behavior. And the reason why in colleges they don't advertise when somebody has committed suicide, I mean, there was an instance when I was at URI where somebody did commit suicide and I knew about it. I'm trying to be careful. I'm trying to be careful with my language because commit suicide is a little bit of an outdated. They died by suicide. They didn't commit suicide. I'm trying to be more conscientious of my word choice. When somebody dies by suicide, I knew about it because somebody in my circle knew that person and knew how they died. But generally, if a student dies, it's not advertised their manner of death. And the reason why is because at that age level, in that situation, when one person takes the plunge, when one person does that, when one person dies by suicide, it can actually embolden other people to act on those same urges. And so they want to keep everybody safe. So they do keep that hush hush. And in that instance, I can totally see why that's appropriate. But when it comes to, like, within a family, it is helpful to report that, our family member took their life. Okay? Instead of, you know, they just, we don't know why they did. They did it unexpectedly. We're not going to really get into it. Um, and I think that today it's a little bit easier to have that conversation of, yes, somebody close to me died in this manner. 50, 60 years ago, that wasn't the case. So one of the reasons we're seeing an increase in that statistic is simply because people are more willing to talk about it. I'm sure it is happening more frequently as well, which is a problem. But one of the things you have to remember, a lot of these statistics, especially when it comes to crime, violent crime, nonviolent crime, what have you, it's not necessarily happening at an increased rate relative to the population. Now, of course, 2023, there are going to be more murders and, more thefts and everything else combined because there are more people to go around and to actually do that. But it's getting reported more. It's getting found out about. It's getting um, discovered more. Murders are, not the best example, like sexual abuse, for example. Um, we used to not talk about that a lot. There are several, and I think it's a good thing that we talk about it a lot, but, you know, back in the 50s, for example, people were very hush-hush about those types of abuses. And other forms of abuse, like physical and mental abuse, weren't recognized as actual abuse until very recently. It doesn't mean that back in the 50s people weren't being mentally and physically abused. We just didn't really call it that. We just called it, more intense parenting if we gave it a name at all. Okay? So the reason we're seeing an increase in how much sex abuse, how much abuse of any other sort is reported, or, we're seeing an increase, is because it's being talked about more. It's not because it's happening more. And the way we know this is primarily through, like, more anonymous surveys of like older people, when you were a kid, did X, Y, and Z happen? Yes, 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 things like that. And it's like, okay, well, this was never formally reported when this person was, a kid, but we know it still happened. Okay? Or people were surveyed when you were, younger. Have you ever done this, this, and that to a child? Yes. And when that was done, we know that back in olden times, back in previous generations, this sort of stuff happened at the same rate that it's happening these days, unfortunately. We just talk about it more. We're more aware of it. It doesn't mean that it's happening at any higher rate. There are not, you know, proportionally speaking. So, like, if the percentage of children who were, sexually abused back in the 50s was, I think it's like 25%, something like that. It's still that percentage because we have, several billion more people today than we did back in the 50s. Of course, the raw numbers are going to be higher, and they're also going to be higher because it's reported more, but it doesn't mean that it's happening any more frequently, if you can understand what I mean by that. It's just reported more. We're more aware of what that scenario actually looks like. So, no, it's, first of all, whether or not we're becoming less religious, which we are becoming less religious, it doesn't mean there's more abuse happening. It just means that we also just happen to report abuses more frequently these days. And that's a good thing that we're reporting these types of things. These sorts of things need to be addressed. Okay? Then you have the issue of who is actually committing these abuses against other people. Is it the religious or the non-religious? Um, Now, not only do we see higher crime statistics in more religious states in the country, we also see a greater proportion of the prison population being some form of Christian than we do the general population. The convicted child molester population, for example, 93% Christian. The general US population is only about 70% Christian. You gotta explain that disparity somehow. And I'm not saying that every Christian is automatically a child molester, or even more likely than a non Christian to be a child molester. I'm just saying that child molesters are overwhelmingly Christian. So, is it really that people who are self described atheists are the ones mostly responsible for these horrible things? No. Okay? You gotta understand that. So, I just needed to get that out there because people really frustrate me when they're like, well, look, we have a really, really messed up world right now, and it's because people don't believe in God. That doesn't have anything to do with it. Even those weird ideas about, like, look at all those communist regimes that caused a lot of problems for people. These were all ruled by, atheists. Well, there have been atheist rulers who did not do that fucked up shit, okay? But also, that's a small subset of the worldwide atheist population that you are drawing from, okay? Politics tend to corrupt everybody, not just the non-religious. So just think about, these terrible things that happened under these rulers were not done in the name of atheism. They were done because these particular people who did happen to be atheists, and I wouldn't lie and say that they were secretly Christian. People are like, well, Hitler was secretly an atheist. No, we don't have evidence for that, and that just sidesteps the point. Um, I don't think we should be making predictions about how somebody is going to behave based on whether or not they believe in God. We shouldn't be doing that. It's not a reliable indicator, okay? And that's exactly my point. That's exactly what I'm trying to drive home. Whether or not a person believes in God is not at all a correlative of how they're going to act. There are so many factors that come before belief in God, okay? There's mental health. There's the person's socioeconomic status. There's the way the person was raised in terms of how they value behavior, how they value morality, human life, blah blah blah. There's mental health. There's circumstance, like, is this person desperate? You know, I would act a lot differently if my flow hood was on fire than if my flow hood wasn't on fire. Or my house. If my house caught fire, the things that I might do during, you know, the hour and a half or however long. I mean, I've never been in a house fire, so I don't know like how that would play out. But the things I might do during that particular situation are going to be different than things I would normally do. So, an example. Now, before I give this example, I will say I did replace the materials, but when COVID first started, I was in Rhode Island, and there was a toilet paper shortage, so I took a couple of toilet paper rolls from a custodial closet that had been left open. Now, that's about the worst thing I've ever done in my life. You know, I don't generally believe in stealing, but this was like, okay, we really need toilet paper, and the building is shut down anyway. People aren't coming in and out of the building needing that toilet paper. So I'll take this toilet paper now, and then once this toilet paper problem blows over, I will buy new toilet paper and replace the toilet paper I took from that closet. And I did just that. I bought new toilet paper and replaced that toilet paper that I had taken. Um, so when you can't necessarily judge, and I'm not saying there's any excuse for, atrocities like genocide, but, you know, policies that incidentally cause a lot of destruction, you can't necessarily judge, just the ruler of a place for how everything plays out when there's already an underlying crisis going on. Should a smarter, more practical person have been in place? Yes. Now, when there are actual genocides, but not every time, like, there have been communist rulers who didn't intentionally set out to kill off half the population. They just weren't responsive enough to famines and problems to actually get anything useful done. That's different, okay? There have been a few genocidal communist rulers in the past. We have to acknowledge that, and I'm fine acknowledging that, okay? But you can't necessarily say that somebody's religious beliefs had anything to do with them taking those particular actions. Because there are plenty of Christians who've done fucked up shit, and plenty of conservatives who would be on my case for saying, oh, they did that just because they were Christian. Because we both know that's not true. We all know that if a Christian does something bad, it's not because they were Christian. They happen to be Christian and they happen to do a really fucked up thing, but it doesn't mean that being a Christian caused them to do that fucked up thing. Okay? And there are fucked up aspects of Christianity. There are things that Christians do that are a little annoying, maybe a little fucked up, like some of the heavy proselytizing and shit like that. I'm like, God, leave me the fuck alone, I do envy some of those, like, street preachers. Like, I wish I had that kind of free time. I wouldn't spend it street preaching, but I do wish I had that kind of free time. It would be really nice to have that kind of free time, right? Everybody likes to have, like, a couple hours where, like, they don't have to answer to anyone, right? I mean, am I wrong there? Anyway, I hope that people, found this useful. Maybe, hopefully not too entertaining, because that wasn't the point here, but, just think before you speak. Know the facts, know how to understand trends and, causation, correlation, things like that. And, I hope everybody has a good week, day, whenever this gets posted. Yeah, thanks for watching.